Before we get started in 2 Kings 7, let's go through the outline of the book. And again, we've outlined the 1st and 2nd Kings together. As the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings is dealing with the reign of Solomon. Then beginning at chapter 12 and going through the 17th chapter of 2 Kings is the divided kingdom. And then beginning at chapter 18 through 25 of 2 Kings, we have the fall of both Israel and Judah. Again, it's the second time we're going through 2 Chronicles. We haven't been there in a couple of weeks, but we'll pick up in 2 Chronicles later on. We've divided it into a couple of sections. There's the reign of Solomon in 1 to 9, and then there's the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom. As again we've mentioned before, in the book of Chronicles, we're following the line of David, and we're only dealing with the line of, or with those in Israel as they come in contact with the kings of Judah. 2 Kings chapter 7, but really before we get to start in chapter 7, I want to back up to something we didn't really spend much time on last week in 6, because this sets up what's taking place here in chapter 7. If you remember last week in chapter 6, as we were coming towards the end of class, we talked about that the Arameans were getting ready to siege Samaria. And this is the case where the people in Israel had resulted to cannibalism at this point, where it said in verse 25 that a donkey's head sold for 8 shekels of silver and a fourth of a cab of dove's dung for 5 shekels of silver. I mean, the time became so desperate that a donkey's head and dove's dung were delicacies in Israel as they were getting ready, as the Arameans were getting ready to siege Samaria. Well, in the very last couple of verses of this text, word had been sent to Elisha. In verse 31 it said, "May God do so to me and more also if the head," this is the king of Israel, "if the head of Elisha the son of Shaphat remains on him today." So he sends messengers to him, and in verse 32, as Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him, and the king sent a man from his presence, but before the messenger came to him, he said to the elders, "Do you see how this son of a murderer has sent to take away my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door shut against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him?" While he was still speaking with them, behold, the messenger came down to him, and he said, "Behold, this evil is from Yahweh. Why should I wait for Yahweh any longer?" So that's what's taking place at the end of chapter 6, where the king has sent these messengers down to Elisha because his goal is to kill Elisha. He's blaming all of this evil that's going, all this the bad that's happening to the people on Elisha. And so he's sending word down to Elisha, or messengers down to Elisha. And Elisha tells them to keep them out in verse 32, for their master's feet are behind them. And then in verse 33, that's when the messenger says, "Behold, this evil is from Yahweh. Why should I wait for Yahweh any longer?" So look at verse 1 of chapter 7. We're still... when the Bible, of course, it was not originally divided into chapters and verses, but when it was divided into chapters and verses, it's very good in most cases, but this is one of those cases where the chapter break is a little off because those verses go with what we're fixing to start in verse 1. So remember verses 32 and 33 as we start in verse 1. This is the same discussion from last week being finished. Then Elisha said, "Listen to the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, about this time tomorrow, a seah of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria." Now I want you to think about the contrast as to how quickly things are going to turn. What were the prices in the previous chapter of dove's dung and a donkey's head? Think about those prices for just a second. In verse 25 of chapter 6. A donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the cob of dove's dung sold for 5. Well, now what's this stuff supposed to sell for the next day, according to Elisha? What is the seah of fine flour going to sell for? A single shekel. What about 2 seahs of barley? A shekel. So things are looking up. Now things are fixing to be looking up for those in Samaria. I mean, here you were selling a donkey's head for 80 shekels, and now you're actually going to be able to buy the barley, you're actually going to be able to buy flour for just a shekel each. Well, in verse 2, the royal officer on whose hand the king was leaning answered the man of God and said, Behold, if Yahweh should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? Then he said, Behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. So here this royal officer, after Elisha's told them this, what's his response? It's doubt. He doesn't believe that this is going to be taking place. So Elisha tells him that he's going to what? See it, but he won't get to eat. We'll come later on. Keep verse 2 in mind, because we'll come back to verse 2 later on as we go through the text, because we're going to see exactly what takes place to this royal officer as we move later on in the text. But remember this, he was told he would see it but not eat of it. The reason being, he doubted what Elisha the prophet told him would take place. So he's going to see these prices come down. He's going to see the improvement being made in Samaria, but he will not eat of it. Well, beginning at verse 3 then, and going through verse 14 is where the lepers are reporting the Arameans' defeat. There were 4 leprous men in verse 3 at the entrance of the gate. And they said to one another, Why do we sit here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, then the famine is in the city, and we will die there. And if we sit here, we die also. So now come and let us go over to the camp of the Arameans. If they spare us, we will live, and if they put us to death, we will die. So they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Arameans. Then they came to the outskirts of the camps of the Arameans, but behold, there was no one there. We'll stop for just a second and think about their initial response. What are these lepers doing at first? What is their thoughts? Right. We're going to die if we sit here at the gate, we're going to die. If we go in the city, we're going to die. Let's at least go to our enemies, and maybe, just maybe, they'll show us mercy. And at worst case scenario, if we come and they don't, we die like we're going to do sitting here where we are right now. So let's at least give it a shot. Let's go try and see. Maybe they'll show us some mercy. Maybe we won't die after all. But at worst case scenario, we're going to die there just like we're going to die here. In fact, if anything, if they go see the enemies, they're going to die. They may die quicker by going to the enemies. So, right, they're willing to take the chance. At worst case scenario, you end up right where you are right now, is basically their thought. Well, they come down in verse 5 to the camp, and what do they see? Nobody. You imagine as you're sitting here, Samaria is being surrounded. Samaria has this famine going on. Because they're being surrounded by the enemies, everything is looking very dark for Samaria. And these 4 lepers come down to the camp hoping to be shown mercy by their enemies, and they get there, and there's nobody in the camp. Well, verse 6 explains to us why that was. It says, Now the Lord had caused the camp of the Arameans to hear a sound of chariots and a sound of horses, even the sound of a great military force, so that they said to one another, Behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. Therefore they arose and fled in the twilight, and forsook their tents and their horses and their donkeys, even the camp just as it was, and fled for their life. So these lepers came to the outskirts of the camp and entered one tent and ate and drank. Then they carried from their silver and gold and clothes, and they went and hid them. And they returned and entered another tent and carried from there also, and went and hid. So here you have the Arameans ready. They're getting ready to fight. They're getting ready to come into Samaria. And what does the Lord cause them to hear? It's a great noise. It's the sound of, it sounds like chariots. It sounds like horses. And what's their thought at this point as they hear this sound? An army's coming. Surely the king of Israel must have gotten word out to the Hittites and the Egyptians, and there's the sound of this great army coming, so he sent out for help, and here come these other militaries ready to attack us. And so they're afraid, and their response is, we're going to run. How quickly did they run? Yeah, they ran and hid. How quickly did they get out of there, though? They left everything. This wasn't like, okay, we could be in trouble, so let's pack everything up and let's just get out of here. The thought was, as they heard this sound, the sound that the Lord has called to them to hear is, we're under attack, our lives are in jeopardy, we need to get out of here, and we need to get out of here right now. I mean, not only did they leave the tents in silver and gold, they didn't just leave where they were staying, they left their horses. They didn't even take the time to mount the horses. You can imagine if you could see the camp and what's taking place inside their camp. They hear this sound, and the picture is they just take up and they run. Just the second they hear it, they're off. No hesitation. We're in trouble. They're off and running. They don't even take anything with them. Anything that can slow them down, anything that might take them longer to get ready, they're just off and running. So, these lepers are in the camp now, and they go into the tents, and they eat and drink, and they take some of the stuff that's in there, and they go and hide it, and they go to another tent, and they do the same thing. Well, now in verse 9, then they, that is these lepers, said to one another, we are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, but we are keeping silent. If we wait until morning light, punishment will overtake us. So now, come, let us go and tell the king's household. So they came and called to the gatekeepers of the city, and they told them, saying, we came to the camp of the Arameans, and behold, there was no one there, nor the voice of man, only the horses tied and the donkeys tied, and the tents just as they were. And the gatekeepers called and told it within the king's household. So here in verse 9, they look around and they're saying, really what we need to be doing is not sitting here feasting, not going tent to tent and taking things, because today should be a day of is a day of good news. When you think about how dark things were looking just previously in Samaria, again, you go back to the end of chapter 6, a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels, a cob of dove's dung sold for 5, and people were eating their own children. That's the kind of way, that's how Samaria was looking just a chapter earlier. Just mere days and hours earlier. And now, the army that has surrounded them, the army that's keeping them from being able to go out and get food and supplies and all of this, is just gone. And their thought is, if we stay here in verse 9 and we keep silent, punishment will overtake us. So we need to go to the city and we need to tell the king about what's taking place. The fact that these enemies that have surrounded them are gone. We don't need to wait any longer. We need to go tell the king. So they come and they tell them in verse 10, they tell the keeper of the gate, this is what happened. We went down to the camp of the Arameans, and there were the tents, there were the horses, there were the donkeys. The horses and donkeys were tied up. The tents were up just like they had been when they were there. Everything was inside just like it was when they were still in the camp. But there was no people. They've taken off. They've fled. And so he sends, the gatekeeper does in verse 11, to tell the king's household. And the king in verse 12 arose in the night and said to his servants, I will now tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know that we are hungry. Therefore they have gone from the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, when they come out of the city, we will capture them alive and get into the city. And one of his servants answered and said, please let some men take 5 of the remaining horses which remain in the city. Behold, they will be in any case like all the multitude of Israel who remain in it. Behold, they will be like any case, like all the multitude of Israel who have already come to an end. So let us send and see. They took therefore 2 chariots with horses, and the king sent after the camp of the Arameans, saying, go and see. So here the king is saying, well, the Arameans, the camp is empty, but they know how desperate we really are. They know how much we need food, so they're not really gone, they're just hiding. They just sort of left and make it look like they took off fleeing, but they're just nearby and they're hiding. And the king of Israel's thought is they're waiting there, and the second we come out of the city for food, what's going to happen? They're going to sneak in. They're just going to take the city. We're playing. His thought is we're playing right into their hands. This is what they want us to do. And one of his servants points out to him, well, let us take some men and send them down to the city. Down to the camp. Send them out of the city down to the camp with the horses that remain. And the servant's logic here is the same logic the lepers were using just previously. And that is, okay, if the Arameans are still out there, then you know what's going to happen to the city? We're all going to die. And not only will the city be destroyed and us die if we stay here any longer, there have been many people who have already died in the process of this famine. He pointed out that theirs will be like all the multitude who remain in it. You know, if they go out, what's going to happen to them is what's going to happen to all of us if they're still there. And if they go out, it's just going to happen to them what's happened to all the people that have already died and what's been going on. So why don't you send somebody to go out and see if this is actually going on? Send somebody out and let's see if maybe, just maybe, they fled like the leper said they did. Well, beginning at verse 15 now, we have where they're actually going to come in and plunder the things of the Arameans. Then they, that is the ones the king sent out, went after them to the Jordan, and behold, all the way was full of clothes and equipment which the Arameans had thrown away in their haste. Then the messengers returned and told the king. So the king decides to listen to that advice of the servant. Let's send them out. Let's go see if maybe they fled. And when he sends them out, he finds that they've actually fled the city. So the people went out in verse 16 and plundered the camp of the Arameans. Then a seah of fine flour was sold for what? A shekel. And 2 seahs of barley were sold for a shekel, according to the word of Yahweh. You know what's taking place here in verse 16 is exactly what Elisha said in verse 1 was going to happen. That tomorrow, the very next day, at this time tomorrow, this is going to be the price of a seah of fine flour and 2 seahs of barley. They're each going to sell for a shekel. Of course, there's that royal officer who doubts. We go on through. The lepers decide that at twilight they're going to head on out. They head out. They find that the camp is empty. Then they come back and report it. And so it's about that time, about the next day, that is from the time Elisha went about a full day to the time that they go out and they're plundering. And after they plunder the things of the Arameans, a seah of fine flour sells for a shekel and 2 seahs of barley sells for a shekel. Just like the Lord had told Elisha was going to happen. So in verse 17, the king appoints the royal officer on whose hand he leaned to have charge of the gate. This is the man in verse 2 who doubted. This is the man in verse 2 that said, behold, if Yahweh should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? That's this man. That's that same royal officer that is now in charge of the gate. But the people trampled on him, the second half of verse 17 says, at the gate. And he died just as the man of God had spoken, who spoke when the king came down to him. So it happened just as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 seahs of barley for a shekel and a seah of fine flour for a shekel will be sold tomorrow about this time at the gate of Samaria. And the royal officer who answered the man of God and said, now behold, if Yahweh should make windows in heaven, could such a thing be? And he said, behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. And so it happened to him, for the people trampled on him at the gate, and he died. When you think about that for just a second, not only does Elisha tell him back in verse 2, after his doubting that he's going to die, he actually tells him that before he dies, what's he going to see? He's going to see what Elisha prophesied. So here Elisha says that these prices are coming down to where 2 seahs of barley are a shekel and a seah of fine flour is a shekel. And you're going to see that. But you're not going to eat of it. So here this man is. Here all of a sudden everything is selling for so much cheaper. The king turns to the royal officer and says, go to the gate. He wants him to be the one in charge of the gate. He gets to the gate, and the people of the city are so excited. And I mean, we would be too, if what our delicacies were donkeys' heads and a cob of dove's dung. And the people are so excited, they come in to get the food, they come in ready to get everything, and they trample the royal officer underfoot. And he dies. He saw it, but he never ate of it, just like Elisha said was going to happen. And that should serve as a warning to the kings of Israel in this case, that as the king is here watching what's taking place, the king is there next to this royal officer. He's the man that comes with the king. He should know now, the king should, that Elisha is speaking on behalf of God. As you move through the books of 2 Kings and 1st and 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, as you move through the stories of the divided kingdom, you can't help but wonder why it was that there were so many people who lacked faith in those days, as here are the people that have the prophets coming to them and saying, here's what's going to happen. And here it happens. And yet in the end, these people most of them never bring about real change. Nobody in Israel ever did. Nobody in Israel was a good king. And you think about that here they were, seeing what the prophets were saying, seeing it come to pass just as they had said, and yet they don't believe. And this should be serving as a warning to them and to any others who might have heard of it. A word of that might have spread throughout the people of Samaria about those that may have heard, Elisha told him he would see what was going to take place, but he'd not eat of it. Elisha told us what the price of barley and flour were going to be. And that's exactly what he said. What he said happened, that he is indeed speaking as a man of God. But here in this story, as we bring chapter 7 to a close, something we see time and time again as we move throughout these is the fact that God keeps His word on behalf of the price that He told him it would be, and as well as the death of the royal officer without ever eating of the lower priced of the food. Well, moving on into chapter 8 now, 2 Kings 8, and we're going through only verse 10 of chapter 9, so we've outlined it here together. The first 6 verses of this chapter is the Shunammite woman's land being restored. Now, who is this Shunammite woman? We talked about her just last week. What do we remember her for? She built that upper room for Elisha, and it was her son that died that we read about last week. And Elisha comes. Remember, Gehazi, the king, Elisha's servant, puts the staff on him. Nothing happens. And Elisha comes in and stretches him out, prays to the Lord and stretches himself out on him. And then he does it a second time, and the boy sneezes, and he's alive. So Elisha spoke to the woman in verse 8. He spoke to this woman, the Shunammite woman, whose son had been restored to life, saying, "Arise and go with your household and sojourn wherever you can sojourn. For Yahweh has called for a famine, and it will even come on the land for 7 years." So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God, and she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. So here Elisha comes to her in verse 1 and says, the Lord has said there's going to be a famine, and this famine is going to last 7 years. So you need to go, you and your family, and you need to go sojourn elsewhere. Now, this Shunammite woman, considering all the things that she's already seen taking place, goes and does exactly what Elisha told her to do. Again, you think about the story of chapter 4, where we're first introduced to this woman, that Elisha did something or said something that she knew he was a man of God, so she built this upper room for him. And when her son died, she sends for him, or goes to him for him to come back, and he brings her son back to life. So she knows that what he's speaking is going to be the truth. He's a man of God. He's a prophet. If he's telling her there's going to be a famine in the land 7 years, then what? There's going to be a famine in the land, and it's going to last 7 years. So she does exactly what he said. She gets up, her and her household, and she goes, and they dwell in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. But it happened in verse 3, at the end of 7 years, that the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went out to cry out to the king for her house and for her field. And when the king was speaking with Gehazi, the young man of the man of God, saying, "Please recount to me all the things that Elisha had done." Now it happened as he was recounting to the king how he had restored to life the one who was dead, that behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life was crying out to the king for her house and for her field. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." Then the king asked the woman, and she recounted it to him. So the king appointed for her a certain officer, saying, "Restore all that was hers, and all the produce of the field from the day that she left the land even until now." You can imagine quite the coincidence as the king turns to Gehazi, who is the servant of Elisha that we read about previously. He's the one that again went ahead and placed the staff on the Shunammite woman's son in chapter 4. This is the same Gehazi that goes out to Naaman for the gift that Elisha refused and is struck with Naaman's leprosy. Well, here the king is asking Gehazi to recount to me the things that Elisha has done. All the great things that he's done. And here Gehazi begins to tell the story. Well, you can imagine as he's sitting there, well, there was this woman who had a son, and the son died, and Elisha went in and restored the child to life. And at that time, there's this woman crying out to the king for her land to be restored. And could you imagine probably the shock on Gehazi's face as he goes, "My lord the king, that's the woman whose son was restored. That's the woman that the story he's telling about." Well, now the king is wanting to verify that story. He didn't just simply take Gehazi's word at it. He asked the Shunammite woman to recount the story. And when she tells the story about what happened with her son, what does he decide to do? What's the king do? He has an officer take and restore all that is hers. In fact, not only is he to restore the land, but what else is he to restore? 7 years worth of produce of whatever came off of it. So he says, restore the land to her. Give her back her land and give her the produce that was taken from it in that time frame. 7 through 15, Elisha predicts Hazael's what Hazael's going to do. Elisha comes to Damascus, and now Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, was sick. And it was told to him, saying, "The man of God has come here." And the king said to Hazael, "Take a present in your hand, and go to meet the man of God, and inquire of Yahweh by him, saying, Will I be restored to life from this sickness?" So Hazael went to meet him, and took a present in his hand, even every kind of good thing of Damascus, 40 camel loads. And he came and stood before him and said, "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you, saying, Will I be restored to life from this sickness?" Then Elisha said to him, "Go say to him, you will surely be restored to life, but Yahweh has shown me that he will certainly die." And he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept. Then Hazael said, "Why does my Lord weep?" Then he said, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the sons of Israel. Their fortifications you will set on fire, and their young men you will kill with the sword, and their infants you will dash in pieces, and their pregnant women you will rip up. And Hazael said, "But what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do this great thing?" And Elisha answered, "Yahweh has shown me that you will be king over Aram." So he went from Elisha and came to his master, and he said to him, "What did Elisha say to you?" And he said to me that you will surely be restored to life. Now it happened that on the following day, he took the cover and dipped it in water and spread it on his face, so he died. And Hazael became king in his place. Well, this conversation that takes place here between Elisha and Hazael, who becomes king over Aram after the death of Ben-Hadad. Elisha, as he's weeping, Hazael asks what he's weeping about. And Elisha points out to him that I've seen all the terrible things that you're going to do to the children of Israel. And he describes for him there what he's going to do, how he'll set the fortifications on fire, he'll kill the young men with a sword, he'll dash the infants in pieces, and he'll rip up the pregnant women. And what's Hazael's reply in verse 13? Who am I? I mean, here he's just simply sent to go ask a question for the king. And Elisha tells him, the Lord has showed me that what's going to happen. You're going to become king over Aram. Well, Ben-Hadad dies, which Elisha said was going to happen. And then who becomes king? Hazael. Again, as these other stories we've been going through, this is exactly what is pointed out by the Lord. Yes. Right. This wasn't whatever Ben-Hadad thought might kill him isn't ultimately what takes his life. They took the cover and dipped it on water and spread it on his face in verse 15 so that he died. And Hazael, just as was told, takes the throne, which Hazael would have wanted. I mean, who wouldn't want to be king after all? Here Hazael is all. He can be king. Now he's king. Elisha told him he would be. Now he's going to be a thorn in the side of Israel with the things that he's going to be doing to them. Now the rest of chapter 8, real quickly as we move through this, we're going to skip the rest of chapter 8 and come down to chapter 9 and 1 to 10, because what we see in chapter 8 we're going to see when we get over to Chronicles, and I want to hit Chronicles' account because it's in a little bit more detail. But skip on down to chapter 9, 1 to 10 with me real quickly. Now Elisha the prophet called out the sons of the prophets and said to him, "Gird up your loins and take the flask of oil in your hand and go to Ramoth Gilead. And you will come there and look there for Jehu the son of Jehoshaphat the son of Nimshi. And you will come in and bid him arise from among his brothers. And you will cause him to come into an inner room. Then you will take a flask of oil and pour it on his head and say, 'Thus says Yahweh, I will anoint you king over Israel.' Then open the door and flee and do not wait." So the young man of the prophet, went to Ramoth Gilead. Then he came, and behold, the commanders of the military were sitting. And he said, "I have a word for you, O commander." And Jehu said, "For which one of us?" And he said, "For you, O commander." And he arose and came into the house, and he poured the oil on his head and said, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of Yahweh, even over Israel. And you shall strike the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my slaves the prophets, and the blood of all the slaves of Yahweh at the hand of Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male person, both bond and free in Israel. And I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah. And the dogs shall eat Jezebel in the property of Jezreel, and none shall bury her." Then he opened the door and fled. Now keep all this in mind here. What's being said as we're finishing here in chapter 9, 1 to 10, what Jehu's being told, because this is important, as this is going to set up some of the things we're going to see next week, because he's been giving some instructions that he is to go and to utterly destroy the house of Ahab. He's to cut off every male of the house of Ahab, whether bond or free. He's to kill Jezebel. In fact, Jezebel will not be buried, but she will be eaten by the dogs in the property of Jezreel. So keep all those things in mind, because as we finish chapter 9 next week, we're going to see those things coming to pass and Jehu carrying out what he's told to do here in chapter 9 of 2 Kings. Now, if you'll go ahead and turn to 2 Chronicles 21, we're going to cover 21 through 22 and in verse 6. The first 7 verses is Jehoram succeeding his father Jehoshaphat on the throne. And Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Jehoram his son became king in his place. Now he had brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat, Azariah, Jehiel, Zechariah, Azariah, Michael, and Zephaniah. All these were the sons of Jehoshaphat, the kings of Israel. And their fathers gave them many gifts of silver, gold, and precious things, with fortified cities in Judah. But he gave the kingdom to Jehoram, because he was the firstborn. So Jehoram arose over the kingdom of his father, and strengthened himself, and he killed all his brothers with the sword, and some of the commanders of Israel also. Jehoram was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. For Ahab's daughter was his wife, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. However, Yahweh was not willing to make the house of David a ruin because of the covenant with which he had cut with David, and since he had promised to give a lamp to him and his sons forever. So here Jehoram comes to the throne. And just as a side note, as we get into here, if you're following through in the kings of Israel and Judah, and you look at the list of kings in Israel and Judah, this is where it gets confusing. Because Ahab has a son named Azariah and Jehoram. Well, in Judah, Jehoshaphat has a son named Jehoram, who has a son named Ahaziah. And so in Israel, you have Ahaziah followed by Jehoram, and in Judah, you have Jehoram followed by Ahaziah, and they're different people. It gets confusing when you get through here because you hear of a Jehoram over here and a Jehoram over here. So this is Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. This is good King Jehoshaphat that did a lot of good in Israel. It's important to note because in spite of all the good that his father had done, how did Jehoram turn out? Wicked. Jehoram turned out absolutely wicked. He would be one of the most wicked kings to have been in Judah. And so Jehoram, he's so bad in verse 4 that he takes and does what? Kills his brothers. You think at times you didn't get along with your siblings growing up. Here he went and killed all his brothers. He's trying to secure himself, I'll get rid of them. But now he's so terrible that he follows in the ways of who? In verse 6. Of Ahab and in the kings of Israel. This isn't just somebody that was a bad king. Judah had plenty of bad kings. If you were listening to the worst, he would probably be behind Manasseh the worst in all of Judah. But here's a man who follows in the ways of Israel. The reason is who he's married to. Ahab's daughter was his wife. Now we talk about with Ahab that Ahab was wicked before he married Jezebel. But remember, it points out in the story of Ahab that as if it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal. Well, here they have a daughter, Athaliah. We'll talk more about her next week as well. That is married to Jehoram. And so Jehoram is more like Ahab than his own father Jehoshaphat. By the way, who's partially to blame for the way Jehoram turned out? Who holds a lot of blame is Jehoshaphat. I want you to think about this for just a second. Keep your finger here, but I want you to flip back to 2 Chronicles 18. 2 Chronicles 18 and in verse 1. Now Jehoshaphat had riches and honor and abundance, and he allied himself by what? Marriage with Ahab. Here, the daughter of Ahab marries the son of Jehoshaphat. And this is where, again, it can get confusing because we actually have the two lines crossing for a little bit, where we have kings in Judah who are related to both kings in Israel and in Judah. For example, Ahaziah is not only the son of Jehoram of Judah, but he is the grandson of Ahab, and he's the nephew of Jehoram and Ahaziah of Israel. This is where the lines are starting to get crossed. This is why it's confusing when you get through this point in the story. But we have the lines, we have Jehoshaphat's son married to Ahab's daughter, and she leads him to more and more wickedness. And again, Jehoshaphat here is to blame because as good as Jehoshaphat was, he allied himself with Ahab, and that allowed the opportunity for this to happen. He allied himself with him in marriage. Now, Edom had been, in verses 8 through 11, they had been under the hand of Judah, but they revolted against them. And so Jehoram crossed over with his commanders in verse 9 and his chariots, and he arose by night and struck down the Edomites who were surrounding him and the commanders of the chariots. And so Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah to this day, and then Libnah revolted at the same time from under his hand because he had forsaken Yahweh, the God of his fathers. Moreover, he made high places in the mountains of Judah and caused the inhabitants of Jerusalem to play the harlot and drove Judah astray. Again, he's the complete and total opposite of his father. Jehoshaphat is bringing reform, bringing them back to serving God. Jehoshaphat dies and Jehoram takes over, and he takes them in the completely opposite direction, bringing them to worse and worse condition they had been in before all of this reform being brought about by Jehoshaphat. Well, in verse 12, the letter came to him. Then a letter came to him from Elijah the prophet, saying, Thus says Yahweh, the God of your father David, because you have not walked in the ways of Jehoshaphat your father, and the ways of Asa king of Judah, but you walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, and have caused Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to play the harlot as the house of Ahab played the harlot. And you have killed your brothers, your own family, who were better than you. Behold, Yahweh is going to smite your people, your sons, your wives, and all your possessions with a great calamity. And you will suffer a severe sickness, a disease of your bowels, until your bowels come out because of the sickness day by day. Well, Yahweh stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines in verse 16, and the Arabs who bordered the Ethiopians. They went against Judah, invaded it, and carried away all the possessions found in the king's house, together with his sons and his wives, so that no son was left to him except Jehoahaz, the youngest of his sons. Now it happened at the course of time, at the end of 2 years in verse 19, that he was struck with disease in verse 18, and in the course of time, in 2 years, he died of that. Just as the Lord had said. I want you to notice something in verse 20 with me rather quickly. This is a sad statement. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 8 years. And he departed with no one's regret. And they buried him in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. Jehoram dies to no one's sorrow. I want you to think about that for just a second. Why is it, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, why is it we often sorrow at funerals? Because we're going to miss the person. That's often the reason for sorrow, is because of what we look back at what we're going to be missing in that relationship now that they've passed on. But when Jehoram passes on, nobody regrets it. Nobody's sorrowful. Nobody's going to miss him. In fact, when they bury him, they do bury him in the city of David, but they don't even bury him with the other kings. Here's where you have the kings buried, and he's buried somewhere else. He's not even buried with the kings like the others would be. Verses 1 to 6 now, Ahaziah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah his youngest son king in his place. From the band of men who came up with the Arabs to the camp had killed the elder sons. So Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, became king, and he was 22 years old when he became king. And he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, that it would be Ahab's daughter. And he walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother was his counselor to do wickedly. So here is Ahaziah who takes the throne, and he's just as bad as his father. He's as bad as his father. He's following in the steps of Ahab, who would be his grandfather. He's following in that kind of line there. And so here we have these two very wicked kings back to back here ruling in Jerusalem. Now the fact that Ahaziah is the grandson of Ahab is important when we get into next week's story. And we talk more about Jehu and Jehu carrying out what he was told to do. Our time is quickly getting away from us, but I want to look at a couple of things real quick. I think when our practical lessons, we see the effects of bad decisions made, whether that's the decision made particular for Jehoshaphat to ally himself with Israel, because that had some long-lasting ramifications. Not seen in the days of Jehoshaphat, but on down the line, some long-lasting impact by the decision he made. We can't take for granted the things that we may have learned from our parents. Here's Jehoram, who's the son of a good man in Jehoshaphat, and yet he turns out to be the opposite. Sometimes today we can take those things for granted, the things that we've learned, and think about how we've been educated and what we've been told about the Lord and how we may have, quote, grown up in the church. But remember what is said in the book of Ezekiel, that the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, nor the father the iniquity of the son. Well, the opposite is true as well. The righteousness of the father does not justify the son, and vice versa. And then we see the influence of a spouse and what happens to Jehoram and Athaliah. Next week we'll finish chapter 9 and chapter 22 and go on through chapter 12 of 2 Kings.